Canada has 5 problems that you have to take into account because all of them affect real estate. The first one is geographic and political. The population is stretched out, basically hugging the American border for warmth. And because of the way that Canada was formed as a codominium of Anglos in Ontario and Quebecois in Quebec, you have made the decision very early on in your process that the provinces have immense power vis-a-vis the central government. That means you didn't get your first trade deal until about 3 years ago. When I say trade deal, not with another country, within Canada. So internal barriers to trade remain immense, and almost every province in the Canadian system, as this graphic shows, has a greater an economic relationship south with the United States than it does with their own co-nationals. And in that sort of environment, Canada is always going to be incredibly exposed to international trends, especially as involves the elephant next door. Now, you fast forward 10 years, you do away with provincial autonomy somehow, that changes. I don't think that's going to happen in 10 years.
If we're not trading enough between provinces, what do you see as being the biggest opportunities for us to do more there?
You have become so used to exporting raw commodities to the wider world because the United States has most of what it needs already, and then just participating in American automotive because that's where the market is. If you really, really, really do want to have a cross-Canadian system for trade, you're going to have a much more efficient east-west transport system. But I'm not sure that will work with NAFTA clauses because you have to allow North-South to work just as well as East-West under the clauses of the new treaty. So anything that you do is going to be for integration has to be between large population centers. And the only 2 large population centers that Canada has in very close proximity that can get synergies are Montreal and Toronto. And so for you to solve that, you have to solve the core Canadian identity question over what it means to be Canadian, and it has to be the Anglos of Toronto and the Quebecois of Quebec who will answer that question the same way for this to work. That's a question you're very familiar with, and I think if you had an answer to it, you would have provided it already. Problem number 2 is strategic. This is a Cold War map. All the dots are where the Russians had their military bases. During the Cold War, Canada was in a privileged position. Now, the United States had created globalization in order to build an alliance to fight the Soviets. And whenever we tried to get a trade relationship with other countries, we always had to give in a little bit because we got full security control as a result. So that was the guns for butter trade that defined the Cold War and American strategic policy. Now, Canada, because it's on the flight path for the missiles from the Soviet Union to the United States, could have been a security free rider. You could have been neutral. To your credit, you chose not to. In fact, to your credit, the Canadians were always the first ones for any fight. If they saw a crisis in the world, they'd pick up the phone, they'd call the president, and the first words the Canadian Prime Minister always said is, "We see what's happening, we're here, how can we help?" And that made Canada our fastest friend. But you weren't dumb about it. The next words out of the Canadians' mouth, after all the security details were worked out, be like, "We would really appreciate a little bit more market access for Quebecois cheese, or Ontarian spark plugs, or whatever it happened to be, softwood timber, if you will." On over 70 different occasions, Canada carved little melon scoop exemptions out of American trade law, and all of those were folded into NAFTA 1. And that's how things lasted. Until this guy came along. We've been moving away from the globalist approach in the United States for some time, but Donald Trump was the first one to make it the centerpiece of his foreign policy. And he loved Trudeau, because Trudeau was perceived around the world as the only world leader that Donald Trump was smarter than. With that in his back pocket, Trump played hardball on trade negotiations, and all of those exemptions that Canada had spent 40 years building into American trade law were jettisoned in the NAFTA 2 discussions. The only reason that there's even an adjudication function in there isn't because of Canada, it's because Nancy Pelosi put it in at the last second within the US House. Now, as we all know, Justin Trudeau is not the brainchild that is running Canada. That would be Christina Freeland. And at the time that Trump became president, she was your trade negotiator and ultimately your foreign minister. And she attempted to play the old playbook in the NAFTA negotiations, the idea that Canada has a special place in American trade law and it's justified in getting its exemptions. And I'm not saying this to denigrate her. I think she's one of the smartest people on the planet right now. But her first week on the job was Trump's first week on the job. And she was handed a playbook that became obsolete the day she took her office. And so she was pushing for things into NAFTA 2 that the United States had no interest in, on labor, on environmental regulations. And at the end of the day, the Americans got sick of it and cut a bilateral deal with the Mexicans to cut Canada out of NAFTA completely. And this is the photo from the stage when she found out. The Mexican and the American negotiators didn't tell her ahead of time. And after this meeting, she was simply told, the United States is going to proceed with this in 8 days with the Mexicans. You have 8 days to accept the original terms. If you don't, fine, you're on your own. 7 days later, Justin Trudeau signed, and we got NAFTA 2. Problem number 3, geography. What you're looking at here is not a population density map. It is a spatial expansion map. So cities that are in green or blue are not very physically constrained. They can expand in almost all directions. That keeps development costs low. Cities that are in red and orange have difficulty. Maybe they have an ocean or a mountain or a national park or some sort of protected wetlands or something. They can't physically expand very easily. And so their internal land costs tend to be very high. That makes for expensive housing. We've got 3 trends that are going on in Anglo-America right now, same on both sides of the border. Number 1, because of COVID, not a lot of people want to be reliant on public transport. Cities with a circle can't function without city transport, so people are moving out. Number 2, the baby boomers on both sides of the border want to move somewhere warm. They don't want to shovel snow in February. They're moving south, or in the case of Canada, west. And then third, the millennials are coming of age, they're raising families, and they want to be in a place where they can have a backyard. They have to move to a place where land costs are lower. So we're seeing people moving out of the coastal cities, and that's on both sides of the border, into the interior, specifically in the American South, Southwest, and West. You guys don't have a lot of room. I know that Canada is a freaking huge country, but if you start preferencing away from Vancouver and Montreal and Toronto, there aren't a lot of other options. And so you're seeing significant distortions across your entire labor